Yo, so I'm chilling at home this morning, just trying to enjoy my Sunday. You know how it is? And I've got ESPN on in the background because I always have sports on, even when I'm not actively watching. First Take comes on, and normally I might switch over to something else or just let it play while I'm scrolling through my phone. But something about the way the show opened today made me actually stop what I was doing and pay attention. The energy was different. Like you could tell something big was about to be discussed. Stephen A. Smith is already at the desk looking animated. Mad Dog Russo is sitting across from him with this expression that's half curiosity and half confusion. And Molly Karam has this smile on her face, like she knows the conversation is about to get spicy. Hey, what's up everyone? Before we dive into everything I have for you today, I need to share something real with you that would mean the absolute world to me. That subscribe button right there. Hitting it right now would bring me one step closer to my dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers. I know you're eager to get into all this content, but real quick, just smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. It's such a simple thing. It takes literally 1 second, but it's honestly the biggest way you can support this journey and help me reach that milestone. Trust me, every single subscription gets me closer to that goal. And honestly, it would mean everything to me. So, do me that quick favor right now and be part of this dream becoming reality. They kick things off by talking about the coaching carousel that's been happening around the NFL, specifically in the NFC West, where there's been a ton of movement over the past 24 hours. Stephen A. starts going through all the dominoes that have fallen, talking about how Clint Kubiak left the Seahawks to become the head coach of the Raiders, how Mike LaFleur left the Rams to become the head coach of the Cardinals, and how all of this is creating opportunities and challenges for teams across the division. Mad Dog is nodding along, adding his own commentary about how coaching changes always have ripple effects that go beyond just the teams directly involved, and how smart organizations use these moments of transition to get better while their rivals are figuring things out. Then Stephen A. does that thing where he pauses for dramatic effect, and you just know he's about to drop something that nobody's expecting. He says that, according to sources he's been speaking with around the league, the Los Angeles Rams are not just sitting back and accepting that they lost their offensive coordinator. They're actively exploring ways to get better and position themselves for the future. And then he says something that made me literally put down my coffee and stare at the TV. He says the Rams have had internal discussions about potentially trading for Anthony Richardson, the young quarterback from the Indianapolis Colts, who's had such a tumultuous start to his NFL career. I'm like, wait, what? The Rams? Anthony Richardson? That makes no sense at first glance because the Rams have Matthew Stafford, who's still playing at a really high level, who just took them to the NFC Championship game, and who seems like he's got at least a couple more good years left in him. But then, Stephen A. starts explaining the logic behind why this could make sense. And I've got to admit, the more he talks, the more I'm like, okay, I can actually see the reasoning here even though it sounds crazy initially. Stephen A. says the key to understanding this potential move is thinking about it from a succession planning perspective rather than an immediate need. He explains that Matthew Stafford is 37 years old. He's been taking a beating in this league for over 15 years, and while he's still really good right now, the Rams have to be thinking about what comes next. Stephen A. says, the worst thing you can do as an organization is wait until your quarterback retires or falls off a cliff before you start looking for a replacement, because then you're scrambling and making desperate decisions. He says the smart play is to identify a young quarterback with elite physical tools, bring him in to sit, and learn behind your veteran for a year or two, and then have him ready to take over when the time comes. Mad Dog interrupts at this point, and he's got this skeptical look on his face. He says, hold on, Stephen A. Are you seriously telling me the Rams should trade for Anthony Richardson, who's been a disaster in Indianapolis? He says Richardson can't stay healthy, he can't make consistent decisions, he got benched for Joe Flacco at one point, and those are massive red flags that you can't ignore. Mad Dog says the Rams are in win-now mode, They just made it to the NFC Championship game, and they should be focused on adding pieces that can help them win a Super Bowl right now, not taking on a project quarterback who might never pan out. Stephen A. doesn't back down, though. He comes right back and says, "Mad Dog, you're missing the point here." He says, the Rams aren't trading for Richardson to be their starter next year. They're trading for him to be their quarterback of the future. Stephen A. breaks down Richardson's physical tools, talking about how he's got one of the strongest arms in the NFL, how he's a legitimate dual threat who can run like a running back, and how he's only 22 years old, which means he's got his whole career ahead of him. Stephen A. says the problem with Richardson in Indianapolis wasn't necessarily Richardson himself. It was the situation he was put in. He was drafted by a team that was trying to compete right away. They didn't have the patience to let him develop. They threw him into the fire too soon, and when he struggled, they benched him instead of working through the issue. He continues by saying that if you put Richardson in a completely different environment, specifically with the Los Angeles Rams, where they have Sean McVay, who's one of the best offensive minds in football, where they have Matthew Stafford, who could mentor him and teach him how to be a professional quarterback, where they have an elite offensive system that's proven it can make quarterbacks better, Richardson could absolutely thrive. Stephen A. says McVay has a track record of developing quarterbacks and getting the most out of them. He turned Jared Goff from a bust into a Pro Bowl quarterback. He's helped Stafford have some of the best years of his career, and he could do the same thing with Richardson if given the opportunity. Molly jumps in at this point and asks a really important question, which is why would the Colts even be willing to trade Richardson when they invested a top 5 pick in him just a couple years ago? Stephen A. has an answer ready. He says the Colts are in a really tough spot because Richardson hasn't lived up to expectations. There are real questions about his maturity and dedication, and they might be thinking that a fresh start would be good for both sides. Stephen A. says the Colts probably aren't going to get back what they originally invested in Richardson, but if they can get a second-round pick or a young player with potential, they might cut their losses and move on to someone else. Mad Dog is still not convinced, but he's starting to engage with the idea more seriously now. He asks what the Rams would have to give up to get Richardson and whether it's worth sacrificing assets when you're in championship contention mode. Stephen A. says he thinks the Rams could probably get Richardson for relatively cheap, maybe a third-round pick and a backup player who's not contributing much. He says the beauty of this move is that it wouldn't cost the Rams much in terms of what they'd have to give up, but the potential upside, if Richardson develops into a franchise quarterback, is enormous. Stephen A. then starts talking about how this would fit into the Rams' overall team-building strategy, and this is where the discussion gets really interesting from a long-term planning perspective. He says the Rams are smart, they know Stafford isn't going to play forever, and they've seen what happens when you don't have a succession plan at quarterback. Stephen A. mentions how teams like Green Bay with Aaron Rodgers sitting behind Brett Favre, or Kansas City with Patrick Mahomes sitting behind Alex Smith, those organizations had the foresight to draft a quarterback before they absolutely needed one, and it worked out incredibly well for them. He says the Rams could be looking at Richardson as that same kind of move, someone who can learn for a year or two and then be ready to take over seamlessly when Stafford retired. Mad Dog brings up the salary cap implications of having 2 expensive quarterbacks on the roster, but Stephen A. counters by saying Richardson is still on his rookie contract, so even though he was a top 5 pick and his salary is higher than later draft picks, it's still manageable within the Rams' cap structure. Stephen A. says the Rams have shown they're willing to be creative with their salary cap management, and adding Richardson wouldn't prevent them from making other moves to improve the roster. The conversation shifts to talking about how Richardson would fit into Sean McVay's offensive system, and both Stephen A. and Mad Dog get really detailed about the X's and O's here. Stephen A. talks about how McVay's offense is built on timing, precision, and getting receivers open through scheme rather than just relying on individual talent. He says Richardson's arm strength would be perfect for the deep shots off-play action that McVay loves to run, and his mobility would add another dimension to the offense that they don't currently have with Stafford. Stephen A. mentions that McVay has historically been able to adapt his system to fit his quarterback's strengths, and he could absolutely do that with Richardson. Mad Dog adds that the zone running game the Rams run would also benefit Richardson because it would take pressure off him to make complex reads on every play. He says, if you can establish the run with their offensive line and their running backs, then you're setting up play action and keeping defenses honest. Mad Dog says Richardson's mobility would be huge in that system because you could run zone read concepts and RPOs that put stress on defenses. He says the problem with Richardson in Indianapolis was that they were asking him to be a pocket passer right away. But if you simplify things for him and let him use his athleticism, he could be really effective. Stephen A. brings up a comparison that I thought was spot on. He says Richardson reminds him of a young Josh Allen, someone who was raw and inconsistent when he first came into the league, but had all the physical tools you want in a quarterback. Stephen A. says the Bills stuck with Allen. They built a system around him, they gave him weapons, and now he's one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. He says obviously there's no guarantee Richardson follows that same path, but the blueprint is there for how you develop a quarterback with elite physical gifts. Mad Dog pushes back on this comparison though. He says the difference is that Josh Allen always showed the intangible, the work ethic, the leadership qualities even when he was struggling, whereas there have been questions about Richardson's dedication and maturity. Mad Dog mentions reports from during the season about Richardson not putting in enough work in the film room, not taking practice seriously. And those are red flags you can't ignore. Stephen A. says that's fair, but sometimes a player needs a change of scenery and a wake-up call to realize they need to take things more seriously. Molly asks them to talk about how Matthew Stafford factors into all of this, because bringing in a young quarterback could be seen as disrespectful to your veteran starter who's still playing well. Stephen A. says that's a legitimate concern, but he thinks if the Rams handle it correctly, it wouldn't be an issue. He says you sit down with Stafford. You explain that this is about planning for the future and not about replacing him right now, and you make it clear that he's still the guy and Richardson is just there to learn. Stephen A. says Stafford is a pro. He's been around long enough to understand how the business works, and he'd probably be supportive of mentoring a young quarterback. Mad Dog isn't totally convinced by this argument. He says even if Stafford says all the right things publicly, having a highly drafted young quarterback on the roster creates pressure and questions, and that can be a distraction. Mad Dog says the last thing you want when you're trying to win a championship is drama at the quarterback position. Stephen A. says, but that's only if you let it become drama. If everyone in the organization is on the same page about what the plan is, it doesn't have to be a problem. They spend some time discussing what Sean McVay's role would be in all of this, and Stephen A. makes the point that McVay is one of the best quarterback developers in the NFL. He talks about how McVay helped Jared Goff become a #1 overall pick, who took the Rams to the Super Bowl, how he's maximized Stafford's abilities and helped him win a championship, and how he could absolutely do the same thing with Richardson. Stephen A. says McVay's system is perfect for a young quarterback because it simplifies reads, gets receivers open through scheme, and doesn't require you to be a hero on every play. He says if Richardson can just execute what's asked of him and not try to do too much, he could be really successful in that offense. Mad Dog brings up the injury concerns with Richardson, which is definitely a major issue that can't be ignored. He talks about how Richardson has missed significant time in both of his NFL seasons, how he takes unnecessary hits because of his playing style, and how there are legitimate questions about whether his body can hold up. Mad Dog says the Rams can't afford to invest in a quarterback who's going to spend half the season on injured reserve. Stephen A. acknowledges this is a concern, but he says Richardson is young enough that maybe with better coaching and a system that protects him better, he won't have to take as many hits. The conversation continues, and Stephen A. brings up the business side of this potential move. He says the Rams are going to have to make some tough decisions about Stafford's contract in the near future, and having a young quarterback on a rookie deal gives them financial flexibility. Stephen A. says If Richardson develops into a starting-caliber quarterback, the Rams could either trade Stafford and recoup some assets, or they could let Stafford play out his contract and then transition to Richardson seamlessly. He says either way, having options at the most important position in football is never a bad thing. Mad Dog challenges this by saying, "But what if Richardson never develops? Then you've wasted assets acquiring him, you've wasted time trying to develop him, and you've potentially created unnecessary tension in your locker room." Mad Dog says this is why most teams don't try to develop a successor, while their current quarterback is still playing well, because it rarely works out the way you hope. Stephen A. fires back and says, "But the teams that do it successfully are the ones that stay competitive for decades. Look at Green Bay, look at Kansas City. Those are the model franchises in the NFL." Molly tries to get them to make predictions about whether this is actually going to happen or if it's just speculation. Stephen A. says he thinks there's real substance to this. He's heard from multiple sources that the Rams have at least discussed it internally, and while he's not saying it's a done deal, he wouldn't be shocked if it happened. Mad Dog says he'll believe it when he sees it. He thinks this is one of those things that teams talk about in meetings, but rarely follow through on, because the complications outweigh the benefits. They also talk about how the recent coaching changes in the NFC West factor into all of this. Stephen A. mentions that with Clint Kubiak leaving Seattle and Mike LaFleur leaving the Rams, there's going to be some transition and adjustment period for teams in the division. He says the Rams are smart enough to use this period of change to their advantage, and maybe acquiring Richardson is part of that strategy. Mad Dog says the NFC West is going to be really interesting next season, with new head coaches in Arizona and Las Vegas, with Seattle having to replace their offensive coordinator, and with the Rams trying to figure out how to get back to the Super Bowl. Stephen A. makes an interesting point about the Rams' window to win. He says the Rams are in a tough spot because they've got some elite players like Cooper Kupp and Aaron Donald who are getting older. They've got Stafford, who's not going to play forever, and their championship window is closing. Stephen A. says if they're going to win another Super Bowl, it's probably going to be in the next year or two, and adding Richardson doesn't help them with that immediate goal. But he says, you can't only think short-term. You have to balance winning now with planning for the future, and acquiring Richardson would be the future planning part of that equation. Mad Dog agrees with the idea that teams need to think long-term, but he says the Rams have mortgaged so much of their future already, with all the draft picks they've traded away, and all the money they've spent in free agency. He says at some point you have to commit fully to one direction or the other. You can't try to win now and rebuild for the future at the same time. Stephen A. says, but that's exactly what the best organizations do. They find ways to compete now, while also setting themselves up for sustained success. The segment starts winding down, and they both kind of summarize their positions. Stephen A. says he thinks the Rams should absolutely make a move for Richardson if they can get him for the right price, because the upside is too good to pass up, and the cost is low enough that it's worth the risk. Mad Dog says he understands the logic, but he's skeptical that it would actually work out, and he thinks the Rams are better off focusing all their energy on trying to win a championship with Stafford while they still can. Molly thanks them both for the discussion and teases that they'll continue following this story as it develops. The show goes to commercial, and I'm sitting there on my couch just trying to process everything I heard. Anthony Richardson to the Rams was not something I had on my radar at all, but after listening to Stephen A. and Mad Dog debate it for half an hour, I can actually see how it could make sense. The Rams are one of the smartest organizations in football. They're always thinking multiple steps ahead, and if they see value in bringing in a young quarterback with elite physical tools to develop behind Stafford, I wouldn't put it past them to explore it. What really stuck with me from the whole segment was Stephen A.'s point about succession planning and how the best organizations don't wait until they desperately need a quarterback to go find one. The Rams have seen what happens when you don't have a plan at that position, and if they can get Richardson for cheap and develop him under McVay's tutelage with Stafford as a mentor, that could set them up for another decade of competitive football after Stafford retires. Whether Richardson is actually the right guy for that role is obviously a massive question mark, but the concept makes sense. I'm definitely going to be paying attention to see if anything actually comes of this. The NFL offseason is always full of surprises, and the Rams have shown over and over again that they're not afraid to make bold moves when they think it's the right thing to do. Whether trading for Anthony Richardson falls into that category remains to be seen. But after watching that First Take segment, I'm at least open to the possibility that it could happen. And honestly, it would be one of the more fascinating storylines of the offseason if it did.